So thanks for joining me today. Emily, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Emily Loupee, and I work in the insurance industry, and I've known Phil for, several years, it feels like. We recently discovered that we both love reading, and not only reading, but reading classics and classic literature. And we connected on that, so we're going to talk about a book.
Great, thanks. And so what we chose to discuss was A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, a historical novel. And we've discussed it a little bit, but the book is essentially about difficult times in France and England during the period of the French Revolution, to put it kind of in a plain way. It involves families on both sides of the Channel and travel between England and France. So why don't you start with sort of your first impressions of the book? Maybe did you like it? You told me about the audiobook, so tell me about that versus reading it.
So when I ran into Phil, I was actually reading Tolstoy's Resurrection, which is a wonderful book. And Phil said, well, you got to read Tale of Two Cities, or he was listening to it on an audiobook. And I've not traditionally listened to audiobooks. I've been a reader. But I thought, okay, I'll try it. So I did try the audiobook, and I started, kind of just having it on in the car while I was driving. And it was okay. I think I felt like I followed the story decently well. But one of the reasons that I really like to read is language, is really experiencing the language. And I feel, for me, I think I must, well, and I kind of know this from college even, but writing it down or reading written words is a big part of how I am able to absorb and really experience the language. And I think listening to it, I was getting like a surface level, and I wasn't being able to appreciate the turns of phrase and the vocabulary and the language in a way that I'm used to when I read a book. So I got about 3.5 chapters in on the audiobook, and then flipped to the written book and finished it that way.
Fair enough. You got to do what works for you, right? Whatever works. Interestingly, and I'll share in the comments, I guess, the specific version of the audiobook, because there are multiple versions of the actual book. There's different versions of the audiobook recorded by different speakers. I actually really enjoyed the version that I listened to, although the beginning, and I think this is true probably just of the story in general, but the beginning is a little rougher to get through. Yeah. And the story kind of comes together.
That was together. Part of it, yeah.
Yeah. So we talked about the theme of inequality and like rich versus poor, which I think runs through multiple stories. And you mentioned maybe it's a period thing, but I feel like it's definitely a strong theme in that book.
Well, that was during a time in on that continent when a lot of it was feudal, so there was kings and queens and noblemen and clergy, and then there were peasants, right? And there was a big, huge gap between those two groups of people, and there wasn't the ability to move between. So a peasant couldn't rise up into, clerical noble class. And I think there was a lot of anger and frustration, in Tale of Two Cities. Some of the early, pictures they show of the nobility in France in particular is, these very, very rich people carting along on their horse-drawn carriage. In one scene, the carriage tramples and kills a boy, I think, a peasant boy, and the nobleman is, he doesn't even care. It's like it's vermin, it doesn't matter at all. And so it was, these peasants that had nothing, were hungry, were poor, were sick, worked, all day, all night, and to enrich the nobleman, right. And then the nobleman just being not only rich but also cruel. Right. And so there's that tenor, and you get a lot of that in a lot of even reading Russian authors and different authors from around those time periods because of the way that the culture was.
Yeah, he definitely shines the light and makes you feel the want and the hunger and the ignorance. Sort of like those are things that I think both are recurring in this book and then in the Christmas Carol also. Yeah. Sort of themes of want and hunger and ignorance. But one of the things I thought he did well was actually strike a balance between showing the certain excesses of the noble class and their mistreatment of peasants, but then also, later in the book, and especially in the Parisian part of it, showing the excesses of sort of the pendulum swinging the other way, and how, vengeful and sort of callous the swinging the other way can be. And I at least in thinking about it, I felt like it was a revolution. It was the French Revolution, and you can't upset a system like that where all the interests are so entrenched, right? The court, the police, the prisons, the entire machine was built to sustain the king and his people and that class, and to maintain that system. And so in a way, they had to burn it down in order to bring about a change, because working a change through the system is really just not a possibility.
Well, I have a great quote on that. Yeah. So, and you've allowed me to introduce my book. I call this a book. So I was telling Phil, I actually have 8 or so of these at home, and they're notebooks that when I read, and I can say this because I've been charting it for the last couple of years, that I read about a book a week. So I get, in the 50s usually at the end of the year. And it's mostly literature. I don't, unfortunately, read a ton of nonfiction. I would be a much smarter person if I did. But it's a lot of just literature. So it was my first entry. I finished the book January 3rd. So this is my first entry for 2025. I think the brutality of the French Revolution was something that I wasn't aware of. Maybe this is me not studying history very well, but it was so brutal, and indiscriminately brutal. And Dickens says it was the purge needed to cleanse the country out of the ashes, a sunrise. So I have a quote for that. So it said, "I see a beautiful city and a brilliant people rising from this abyss, in their struggles to be truly free. In their triumphs and defeats, through long years to come, I see the evil of this time and of the previous time, of which this is the natural birth, gradually making expiration for itself, or expiration for itself, and wearing out." And here's another one: "Crush humanity out of shape once more under similar hammers, and it will twist itself into the same tortured forms. Sow the same seeds of rapacious license and oppression over again, and it will surely yield the same fruit according to its kind." So, it needed to be brutal. Like, it needed to wrench out of, but it was hard to read. Like, it was tough to kind of sit and just read through it and think, is this really necessary? I mean, there was one part that resonated with me on that, where during the revolution in France, when they talked about 30, 40, 50 people going to the guillotine a day. So they're killing 30, 40, 50 people a day. And it was anyone with money. If you seemed like you had money, you were going down. And there was a comment about, certain people didn't even want to take a carriage, like a taxi, like a horse carriage. They would go on foot on purpose, because even just being seen going through town in a carriage would be proof that you had money, and that you could potentially be put in jail and have your head chopped off. Right. And
to say that they were tried and convicted is sort of not really doing justice to what it means to have a trial, right? Because I think they ask, when it's his turn for trial, they're telling him there were 25 others tried today. And he said, how many of them were convicted? And it's like, well, all of them were convicted, of course. That's just the way it was. It was more of a formality.
And it was the peasants, the wine shop owners and his wife that were kind of the leaders, the underground leaders that kind of led this brutality. So, so overall, I was telling Phil, it wasn't, I didn't love it. And which is a hard thing to say about a Charles Dickens novel. That's probably his most well-known novel. And Phil reminded me, and many, many books at that time were released as a series, like a serial, so they would release a story a week in a magazine, and that's how people consumed it. And it kind of reminded me of that as I was reading it. Like, it felt like it was being just, distributed in bits, like almost like I don't want to, when I say sitcom, I don't mean like it's like a sitcom, because it's obviously a higher level than that, but it felt a little bit like that, like episodic. And I didn't love that. And in the beginning, the character there was kind of like, we're going to learn about this character for this installment, and now we're going to learn about this character for this installment. And they were kind of like just touching on how they're attached to each other, which wasn't my favorite. And then some of the language, I just thought the descriptiveness almost took away from the depth of like the meaning of the book. Like it almost was so flowery as to be almost comical.
It was
at times.
Too distracted with the language and not enough.
Yeah, like I don't know if it was actually giving me like a great profound perspective necessarily, as much as it just felt like the writer was kind of getting away from it a little bit. And actually, I don't think I have those in the book, but I could probably find it on my phone, like in my notes on my phone. Like an example of one of his really flowery pieces. I mean, talk.
Go ahead if you've got it.
Yeah, talk while I'm doing this.
One of the to contrast with that a little bit, I think one of the things I enjoyed about his style of writing was he has a sort of nuanced sarcasm that comes back constantly throughout the book, whether it's and sometimes describing very serious topics and problems, and he'll inject a little bit of humor. Some of that is throughout sort of his observations of the sort of the heartless manner of French people when they're describing their excitement about the assassinations with the guillotine and the guillotine itself, and they call it a barber shaves real close, and it's a sure medicine for headaches, and and meanwhile hundreds of people a week are losing their lives to this contraption. He also describes in a very humorous way, I think, an aborted marriage proposal that was about to happen with sort of a fairly arrogant British gentleman who's going to propose and who has a change of heart on his way, who's maybe a little bit overconfident. And I enjoy the author's description, a little bit tongue-in-cheek of those types of events. But the book does proceed in fits and starts, right? In the sense that it's sort of you can, like you said, it's written in an either monthly or weekly kind of fashion, and you can just tell that it's sort of one block at a time. It feels sometimes like Legos coming together in chunks. But so the another thing that I felt, just to get back to the French Revolution and the horror of all of that, is first of all, there are some real events that are weaved in. At one point, one of the main characters, whose father-in-law trying to protect his son-in-law who's incarcerated in France, they describe how over a 4-day period there were a lot of murders happening at the prisons by mob rule, and that is the actual description of the September massacres, in which over 1,100 people were killed in the prisons over a 4-day period of time. I mean, the prisons were basically stormed by the public, and anyone who was incarcerated there was murdered if they weren't protected. So it is based on some true events. Another item that I observed happens earlier in the book, which is England doesn't really get off the hook either. I mean, the book is really describing the horrors of France at the time from the English perspective, but there is an English trial, and that British trial at the Old Bailey Court in London has a lot of the same elements, frankly, that the Kangaroo Court has in Paris, which is
it's not a
the judge and prosecutor are like this. Yeah. The evidence is flimsy, but
Britain was in a feudal system at the time as well. It didn't go through the painful revolution necessarily. But yeah, it was a similar vibe.
And the defendant in that proceeding was spared, but they did describe in a lot of detail what would have happened had he been convicted, which was he was going to be drawn and quartered, which is just every bit as gruesome and horrible, or if not much more so than the guillotine treatment. So England doesn't kind of acquit itself. And again, I think there he does a good job in terms of balance of showing, okay, France is horrible, but England is not that much better. Yeah. The rich are horrible and they've treated the poor, with terrible cruelty. But that is just turned around, and the poor are now showing that they can be just as cruel as the rich.
Yeah. No, I think that is true. Like looking at it, it's that perspective change that is really interesting. I was trying to find my wordy passage, and I'm struggling right now. But one thing I did write in here that I think is kind of fun is I did, because I know I'm thinking as we're talking, if someone's watching this, hopefully, that they might be thinking, well, what is this story about? You know, like we're like assuming everyone's read this book. One of the things I did in my little book is I did like a really fast, kind of funny synopsis of the storyline.
Okay.
So I'm like, here's the book. So he's just so wordy. But basically, you know, here's the story. A roundabout journey to the main event. We bounce through main characters: the banker, the orphan, the found prisoner, long lost father, the drunken wine shop revolutionaries, the rich guy but good guy, the evil materialist, and then the love story, the little family, and the tragic twist. The good rich guy tries to do the good guy thing, driven by overblown guilt and misplaced responsibility. All of a sudden, the bliss fairy tale turns dark. And that's when, of course, he's in prison. You know, he goes back to. So basically, the good guy that marries the orphan and they're in love and it's wonderful and everything's great. They've got a daughter, but then he gets a letter, and it's from this is a French nobleman in disguise. So he is a French nobleman. He's, you know, the Marquis' son, but he shunned that life. He went to England to live, to marry, to work. To not be part of that, and everything's just fine. And then he gets a letter, and the letter's from one of the workers from his old castle, and it's like, oh my gosh, you have no idea what's going on. They've come and the Marquis is dead, and they burned everything, and they're killing us all, and it's really unfair. And like I didn't do anything wrong, and I just worked for you, and like come on, come help me. Right. And he thinks, oh man, like,
I've only been your loyal servant. Yeah. Come and save me.
Come and save me. Right. And our hero, our main character, thinks to himself, you know, God, I really was wrong. Like, I thought I was being the good guy walking away from this life, but I didn't even think about all these people I left behind. And so he very stupidly goes back to France, and literally the second he walks into France, gets arrested and thrown into jail and is going to be killed. Yeah. Like, I mean, it's just like the second he gets there. So, I mean, that's pretty much the story. That was my synopsis of the story.
Yeah. And there's a lot of deceit throughout the book. I mean, I think deceit and, you know, today we would use the word snitch. Back then they used the word spy. Is sort of a constant theme where people say one thing, but they're only trying to lure you into a different situation and trick you. And there's a lot of backstabbing and trickery that's going on in the background. So, but that's great. That's a much better synopsis than
my quick and dirty.
Yeah.
And I think we could probably like avoid giving the ending because it's a little bit of a twist ending. Yeah. So, you know, read the book for that. But but it is, you know, a concept of doing the right thing and you know.
I had, around the time that we met and started talking about this book, in the news was the murder of the United Health CEO. By Thompson. And the reason that I bring that up at all is because I had just finished this book and I was thinking about Madame Defarge, who's, you know, holds this resentment in her heart from deep wounds that she had as a child. Yeah. And that's kind of,
I forgot that whole side story.
That's an important, an important part of the book and of the overall story. But the reason that I bring that up is because the reaction that we saw from like the
support,
the CEO's murder, and then basically the support for the murderer, it led me to sort of think, wow, like Madame Defarge is alive and well, and she lives here among us. Like there's a definite strain of like lack of sympathy for murdered noblemen happening right now. And so it was to me, it was an echo of a different era that I sort of observed in today's world, where it's just kind of frightening because I think we like to think to ourselves that we've sort of moved past that kind of thing and we're better than that, and our society is more fair and more equal, but yet, you know, there's definitely a strain of resentment there. So not to make it too political, but
I think that's really thoughtful, and I think it's accurate. I think it's absolutely accurate. I think that it's this concept of they were wronged and they're so enraged that it justifies anything and everything. And in this book, anything and everything is pretty darn bad. I mean, they're literally chopping the heads off of children, of people that are arguing. There's no way they could be at fault. And at the end, you know, there's a girl in the line, child. I think she's a young girl in the line to have her head chopped off, and she says, I don't understand, like, what did I have to do with people getting rich, and
Right.
what did I have to do with this? And then she's like, well, I guess for the good of the people, I have to die.
Right.
And she was like, okay, but like, I mean, not okay, but she's like, if it's for the good of France, if it's for the good of the country, and it's to stop the oppression of the peasants, then I guess I have to die. But she's like, I'm only a child. I've only just worked. I don't even know what this is about. This purge mentality is
highlights a level of indiscriminate killing that was happening at the time.
Yeah.
All right, let's end on like a happier note. So why don't you share with us? You've talked about other classic literature that you enjoy. Why don't you share like a suggestion on something, because you didn't love this book. I really did, but Emily didn't. So why don't you share with us something that you did enjoy and that you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're interested in reading about a book from this time era that gets into the kind of the deep philosophical questions of like right and wrong, and also how society is crushing certain people, whatever. I'm more of the Russian writer fan, so I would look at Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. We were chatting a bit about Crime and Punishment and the brothers Karamazov, both excellent books. And I will say to folks that are like, whoa, I can't read that book, they're very readable. I do think Dickens is a little less readable. I think if you're someone who's not used to reading an old book that's written in a language that we don't sound like we talk anymore, I think it's easier to start with Russian writers. I think they're more accessible. And I think you'll find, like Phil was saying, it's not like this esoteric old thing that doesn't exist anymore. It's happening in our lives today. And it just gives you a really great perspective. And there's a reason that these guys are great authors and that they're still talked about and read today. It's because it's phenomenal writing. It really is amazing. So I think it's worth it to read those guys. Hemingway is my favorite author, so I'll plug Hemingway, who was also incredibly readable, very, very easy to read, and transport you, and you get a whole thing from reading Hemingway. So
great, thanks for the recommendation. I asked my daughter to read A Tale of Two Cities, and now she hates me. So maybe I should suggest Crime and Punishment or something from Hemingway instead.
Well, the issue with the Russians, though, I will warn everybody, the names of the people. So Raskolnikov is the main character, but then they have nicknames, like multiple nicknames. So it'll be like Danya, Vanya, Vaska, Ilya, and then it'll be their full name. And so the names will get you. But
okay. Well, so come back and
start with Hemingway.
Come back in 6 months and we'll review the Brothers Karamazov together.
All right.
All right.
Great.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.